And a good Monday evening, folks. Chief Meteorologist Tim Pandajis here with you. I'm excited to kick off our brand new tropical discussion stream that we're going to start doing daily here at 8 p.m. on 13 News Now Plus. And this is basically going to be the next generation of those tropical discussions that we do every hurricane season. A lot of times you'll find them streaming on our website or streaming on YouTube. Now on our 13 News Now Plus platform, this will be exclusively available for you folks at home to enjoy and learn about what's going on in the tropics and be up to date pretty much on all the details needed to be known from the start to the end of hurricane season. Now, it's a soft launch. We're going to get a little bit more in depth as we get a few more weeks into the hurricane season. Luckily, things have been quite quiet out in the Atlantic basin so far. And eventually, this segment will be called Hurricane Hub Live, as we're streaming you live here from Norfolk, Virginia. All right, let's get over to the graphics now and talk about what's been going on out in both the basins, the Atlantic basin as well as the Eastern Pacific, that has been very, very active. So for now, until we transition to the new name of Hurricane Hub Live, why not have some fun with it? T cubed. Tim talking tropics. Monday, June 23rd, 2025. As I mentioned, the Eastern Pacific has been very, very active. Is the Atlantic on deck to kind of wake up? It's been very, very quiet. And that's where we find the Atlantic basin this evening, here on June the 23rd. Nothing going on at all. Okay, main development region out here between Africa and over into the Leeward Islands, still quiet. And usually this area doesn't start to activate until we get towards late July and closer to the peak of the season, when all the atmospheric conditions, environmental conditions really start to line up, and we see storms, tropical waves coming off the coast of Africa, and they move into that fertile environment and they grow quickly. Not the case right now. We've also had a lot of dust, Saharan dust, which is not abnormal for this time of the year. We get storms that kick up the dust in Africa, and it gets carried aloft by the upper level winds, and that suppresses any development for the time being in the main development region. Usually, as you get closer to the Southwest Atlantic, Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean, activity seems to be a little bit more prominent earlier in the season, but so far, just haven't seen anything out in the basin. Now, this evening, there is one area of interest, and it was actually already tagged as an invest. We're going to get a little bit more in depth on what exactly that means here in a couple of minutes. But the new report just came down from the National Hurricane Center at 8 o'clock this evening. And this has downgraded the possibility of this developing into a named tropical system down to 40%, which is still categorized as moderate chances. Sitting at 40% within the short term, within 2 days, and within a week's time, 40% as well. This is down from 60% that it was upgraded earlier. Now, this is nowhere near land. It's well to the northeast of Bermuda, and it's heading away from the U.S. East Coast, heading away from the Canadian Maritimes. So no threat to land, just marine interests, cross-Atlantic trade travel there. But you can see it here on satellite imagery. I mean, not really much at all. High sheared environment, overall conditions aren't very conducive at all for it to develop here. But there is the opportunity, Hurricane Center says, within the next 1 or 2 days, small window of opportunity here that could briefly become a tropical depression, or maybe perform and become a tropical storm. We'll see what happens there. So let's dive into what exactly an invest is. So this system that I just showed you has been tagged Invest 90L. So we have to decode it a little bit. It's almost like an equation. Invest is just short for investigative area. It's a tropical wave or tropical convective complex, pretty much, or just a bunch of thunderstorm activity that the Hurricane Center is keeping a close eye on for potential development. Then followed by a number. This rotates from 90 to 99 and goes through it. Okay, so this is just for kind of record-keeping purposes, from 90 to 99. And then the letter on the end of that is a basin indicator. So since we're in the Atlantic basin, you're going to see it with an L. Now, if this was in the Eastern Pacific or even Central Pacific, you'd see either an E for the East Pac or a C for the Central Pacific. So that's what it means when we bring up, this has been tagged as an invest or not. So up from here would be up to a tropical depression and then to a tropical storm, and that's when it would get a name and carry on from there to a tropical storm, to a hurricane, and potentially major hurricane. That's kind of the chain of progression there. So here's another look at it on satellite imagery. Tropical wave, Invest 90L. Now you look at this and you say, well, 40-mile-per-hour winds here. To become a tropical storm, You need 39 miles per hour or greater. So technically, this has tropical storm force winds associated with it. But just looking at it, it's got no clearly defined center of circulation. Okay, it's very disorganized. So that's why it has not been classified as a tropical depression or a tropical storm, at least up to now. Now, it is moving to the northeast at 14. Pressure overall, I mean, not very low at all because it's not a strong system by any means, and is moving away from any land areas. Now, it's also an environment that's not, I mean, it's marginally conducive for this to try to get its act together, and we've seen it before. They briefly have a period of intensification and maybe pop to a tropical depression or storm for 12 hours worth of time and then quickly dissipate. Could that happen here? Sure. But as we switch things up on satellite imagery and bring up water vapor, and what this is the amount of moisture in the mid-levels of the atmosphere. And the different color banks you're seeing here is the yellow or even rust color that shows up. That's dry air in the mid-levels of the atmosphere. Hues of blue and white showing up there is moisture content that's a little bit more elevated. For a tropical system, you'd want to see this completely surrounded and enveloped within a moist environment. Dry air and tropical systems don't really intermingle too well. A lot of times the dry air will get pulled into the circulation overall and it gets choked off. And you can see the spin here. There is a lot of dry air in this general area getting pulled into the circulation, which is why you see it on satellite imagery. It's almost like a naked satellite imagery. There's not much to it. Not a whole lot of convection. And on top of it, too, it does start to encounter a good amount of wind shear, too. And that opportunity for greater wind shear opens up after about 36 hours from now. All of this shaded area here is increased amounts of wind shear. And what wind shear will do is for developing tropical systems, they're vertical heat engines, right? So they're picking up the heat from the surface of the ocean and driving it northwards. The circulation is vertical. When you get the increased wind shear, that's an increase in wind speed and direction with height, you start to kind of make it a little more horizontal. You start to tilt the system that's trying to become vertically stacked. And wind shear here will be increasing. So any hopes of this achieving tropical depression, tropical storm status after the next 36-hour window closes is quite low. So that'll act to squash any development here by middle of the week. Okay, so this is not going to be something we're going to be talking about for days on end. Now, the Eastern Pacific, on the other hand, I have a scorecard that I keep for the two basins, right, to compare them both. Eastern Pacific here has been performing, okay? We're at 5 named storms so far, 2 hurricanes. Barbara was the first one, and then Eric became a major hurricane and actually made landfall on the Pacific coast of Mexico near Acapulco a week ago. Maxed out as a Category 4 and was the first instance so far this year of rapid intensification. It went from a Category 1, in fact, I think it was a high-end tropical storm, and then rapidly intensified to a major hurricane all within 24 hours. So it was a really something to watch. On the contrary, the Atlantic has been obviously quiet. We haven't even tapped into one single name on the list of our 2025 names. And out in the East Pac this evening, it is still kind of active. No named storms at the moment, but there is another tropical wave that is going to be building into an area that's pretty conducive, especially in the longer term, over the next 7 days, of it developing and possibly becoming the 6th named storm out in the Eastern Pacific. In the short term, conditions aren't all that great. But in the long term, as it builds to the north and west, yeah, we could see that start to develop. High chances, a 70% chance of that developing there. So what's the list of names that we pull from for the Eastern Pacific? There are 2 different name lists. Eastern Pacific, and then we've got the Atlantic basin names, too, that we'll get into in a little bit. But we've already gone through 5, so the next one up would be the F name, which is Flossie. 70% chance of Flossie developing here over the next 7 days, and you can see we go from there all the way up to W. In fact, there's actually a couple more names on the list there. So you may be wondering, well, why has the Atlantic been so quiet, but the Pacific has been? You know, the Pacific Basin actually starts 2 weeks earlier than the Atlantic Basin. The official start of the Pacific is May 15th. Meanwhile, the Atlantic Basin starts on June the 1st. And this is because usually earlier in the season, the Eastern Pacific is more active. And a rule of thumb is when we see the Eastern Pacific being more active, the Atlantic tends to be not so much. And there's a reason for that. Okay, when you get development, tropical development, strong storms developing in the Eastern Pacific, the exhaust from those storms creates wind shear in the Atlantic basin. So the outflow, so you get the inflow at the surface and the outflow aloft. That exhaust, as we call it, creates the wind shear out in the Atlantic basin, which limits development in that basin, on top of the dry air that we've seen persisting for the last several weeks, on top of the Saharan dust plumes that have been coming on off, which is normal this time of the year. So that just adds to the fact that there's been notably nothing out in the Atlantic basin so far. Now, chances of that happening, continuing to happen, probably pretty low. We'd likely see our first named storm in the next couple of weeks as conditions become a little bit more conducive overall, just climatologically speaking. But it has been notably quiet in the Atlantic. No named storms so far this June. Now, that's rare, but it's not unprecedented, okay? The last time we had a June that had no named storms was about 10 years ago, in June of 2014. So an inquiring mind might be like, well, what was that season like? What could it mean for the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season? Well, let's go back to 2014. It was a well below normal season with no named storms in June. Take a look at the storm tracks here. 8 named storms. The first was, I believe, what was it? The A name, I just had it in my head. Arthur, there we go. Arthur was the first named storm, and that was the only storm to impact the United States to make landfall in 2014. And I was there when it made landfall in the Outer Banks just around the 4th of July in 2014. Category 2 hurricane over the Outer Banks. That was it. Wouldn't it be nice to have a hurricane season when we don't have any landfalling storms? We'll see. Just because it happened this way in 2014 does not mean by any means that it'll be a repeat. Could it be? Sure. But overall, the conditions, the overstating conditions that are going on right now in the overall environment in the Atlantic don't really constitute that being a likelihood, okay? And check out the various outlooks for this season, okay? Because there's a lot of things that go into making a hurricane outlook. So we're going to talk about 2, Colorado State University and then NOAA, National Weather Service, National Hurricane Center. On average, 30-year average, there are 14 named storms per season, 7 of which become hurricanes, 3 of which major hurricanes. Last year was another above normal season. It's just been the latest on a long line of active seasons, of course, as we know, and the 2020 was the most active on record. 18 named storms last year, 11 hurricanes, 5 majors. This year, Colorado State saying pretty similar to last year, calling for 17 named storms, 9 hurricanes, 4 majors. NOAA is saying they give a range. They're also calling for an above normal season between 13 and 19 named, 6 to 10 hurricanes, 3 to 5 of those possibly being Category 3 major hurricanes or stronger. So what are we looking at here? What's the difference between 2014 and this year? Well, there's a lot of big factors, okay? Storm activity looks to be closer than average because our ENSO neutral, El Nino Southern Oscillation. El Nino years typically mean less hurricane activity. La Nina years typically mean pronounced hurricane activity because of the amount of wind shear in the Atlantic basin driven by this overall worldwide pattern, okay? When we get a neutral season, that means we've got no El Nino, no La Nina, neutral conditions, meaning wind shear still not likely an increase. So the lack of wind shear in and of itself would mean more storms. So the East Coast tends to see less storm activity during an ENSO neutral year, which is great. But there are other factors in play, too, on top of it being an ENSO neutral forecast for the peak of hurricane season. And those, of course, are going to be how warm is the ocean. And as you know, you've heard the headlines, the oceans have been predominantly warmer each year. Global warming, right? So warm sea surface temperatures lead to higher amounts of energy available in the ocean basins. Tropical systems are heat engines. They thrive off of warm ocean waters. So that could in and of itself lead to an increased activity. So how are we looking out there in terms of sea surface temperatures? What you're looking at here are sea surface temperature anomalies, so how much above average for this time of the year sea surface temperatures are. Wherever you're seeing a shade of yellow, even some orange in there in the subtropics, those are sea surface temperatures that are above normal. Now, you need around 78, 79, 80, ideally, to start to facilitate tropical development, because you get that latent heat transfer from the surface of the ocean to developing atmospheric systems. You have that already. And even in the subtropics, we've got a large area of well above normal sea surface temperature stretching all the way into the Gulf of Mexico, the entire Caribbean for the most part, and most of the main development region as well, dealing with sea surface temperatures that are above the normal for this time of the year. So let's consult climatology. When do we typically see our first named storm in the Atlantic Basin? Well, just a couple days ago is the climatological first storm date, June the 20th. And then look at the gap between the first and the second, all the way until the middle of July. Usually it was our second, based on 30 years of climatology. And then August the 3rd, and then it goes on, so on from there. So even though it's been a quiet June, we're not all that far behind climatology in terms of our first named storm out in the Atlantic Basin. So we'll see when we, in fact, get that first named storm. Let's look back at the last 10 hurricane seasons to see when we had our first named storm. Last year, it came on June the 19th. I forget which, I think it was Alberto. And then you remember Beryl, that developed in late June and became the earliest major hurricane in the Atlantic Basin. Remember, it made landfall in the Houston area. Thankfully, it wasn't a major at that point. It was Category 1 or 2, I believe, when it made landfall. That was the second named storm of the season already. And then 2023, June the 1st, first day of hurricane season was the first named storm. 22 was June 5th. And 21 and 20 was in May, so before the hurricane season even began. And then 19 and 18 were also in May. 2017 was in April, okay? In 2016, this is an anomaly here. We actually had a hurricane in January in 2016, and that was Alex. And that was in the northern Atlantic. It didn't impact anybody, but it was very anomalous, being on January the 12th, and that was the first named storm of that 2016 season. And then in 2015, an early start as well, May 8th. So we are behind the last 10 years, obviously. Here we are almost the end of June, and we still don't have that first named storm out there. Not saying that's a bad thing, great, but obviously it's not going to last, right? Because we've got a long ways to go in this year's hurricane season. So here's the list. Got all these names here, 21 names. Now, what happens if we go through them all? We've done it before. In 2020, we did. We had the Greek alphabet name. Now, that no longer exists. We do have a secondary list of names that we will resort to if we need to, but we no longer use the Greek alphabet. They have just another list of names here. But the first up is Andrea this year, then Barry, and of course it goes on from there as we get further and deeper into the season, depending, of course, on how active it is. So, folks, that's the latest on today's video. We're going to have a lot to talk about going onwards from here. We will break down different aspects of what would make an active hurricane season. We'll get deeper into the science, have a little bit of a discussion. And as we get deeper into the season and we start to really develop the streaming show for you, we'll eventually have some interviews from some very interesting folks. We'll talk trivia. We'll talk history and climatology based on the hurricane season. So we've got a fun lineup coming our way to talk about what could be a very serious situation with some of these storms that may develop. But of course, you can always find us here every night, Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. And in the meantime, you can always find us on social media. Here are my social media tags. We'll join you again here tomorrow night at 8 o'clock to talk more about the tropics. And we'll see what our Invest 90L is doing in the northern Atlantic to see if that develops or just completely falls apart. Until then, enjoy the rest of your Monday.